Welcome to the Monster Guys podcast. Once again, welcome to the Monster Guys podcast. My name is DC McGannon. As always, I'm here with my partner and co-conspirator in all things creative and monster hunting, C. Michael McGannon. Michael, how you doing?
I'm okay. I am leaking thanks to allergies, but I'm doing okay.
Yeah, you're struggling there with it. I hate that you're going through that right now, but
it's fine. We've been through worse. We've been through monster attacks and all of that, so
that's right.
We'll survive.
Today we have a very special guest with us. Lyle Blackburn is on the show with us. Lyle is an author, a filmmaker, and a musician, and is an expert on the famous Fouke monster, better known as the Boggy Creek Monster.
Which is a monster that a pretty big interest, as we have questions about this monster at a lot of the events that we do.
Yeah, we do. We consistently get questions about the Boggy Creek Monster, so we have tracked down an expert with limited knowledge on our side over the years. Like you said, we needed to learn more, so we went straight to the source. Lyle has spent a significant amount of time in Fouke, Arkansas, where the Boggy Creek Monster originates from, at least his legend and the stories there. And we talked to him at length about this creature, what he terms as a southern mystery monster. We also talked to him. We go a little bit east of Arkansas as well in this episode. We travel to South Carolina and we talk about the lizard man, which is another just completely fascinating creature all to itself.
Fascinating, bizarre, and something that I guess had national news coverage, which is completely interesting to us.
Yeah, I mean, full-on law enforcement investigations, and it attracted the attention of the likes of Dan Rather at some point in the past. So we talk a little bit about the lizard man. We also talk a little bit about his upcoming project that he's working on, another documentary film about the Mothman, which I am just stoked about.
Yeah, and hopefully we'll be covering that ourselves pretty soon.
Yeah, we're going to revisit with Lyle in the near future about the Mothman and his doings with that film documentary. You'll hear him talk about it, how the approach they're taking, and doing a very unique approach to that filmmaking experience. So all in all, this is a monster lover's dream right now. We just last month interviewed Troy Hudson, who is involved with the Sasquatch Genome Project, deep into the science of Bigfoot and Sasquatch, particularly in North America, but we touched quite a bit on the Bigfoot phenomenon around the world. A lot of great response. So far, actually, one of our most downloaded shows to date. So very excited about that. We continue in that vein today, talking with Lyle about the Boggy Creek Monster, the Lizard Man, Mothman, and I can say without saying that the next few months are just getting deeper and deeper into the phenomenon of, or the topic of, cryptozoology and the study and the tracking of cryptids, particularly in North America, but extending globally in many cases. So I'm just super pumped about it. I don't know if you can tell, but I'm excited about this. I love this topic. I love going out there looking for this kind of stuff. I'm just pumped that we have an opportunity to speak to some experts in these unique fields of research and tracking.
And some experts that actually get in there and talk to, I would say modern day folklorists. And that is to say, not dismissing any of this as just folklore, but going back to what folklore really meant, even back when people like Lafcadio Hearn and W.B. Yeats traversed their different locations. People like Lyle, they're actually going in and talking to people firsthand, and they are not just studying this from afar. They're at locations, they are talking to people, and they're in the thick of it.
I agree. People like Lyle, when you listen to him, you're going to understand what I mean when I say that this guy's a modern day storyteller. Not just in dealing with monsters, but even in his music. The track that played opening our podcast is one of his band's tracks, and the song at the end of the podcast, which is a very cool story type song, story driven song, Drink with the Living Dead, is also from his band Ghoultown. So this guy's a storyteller all the way through. And like you said, he has spent, just like Troy when we talked to him last month, these guys are spending years and years of their lives deep into the thick of the communities where these things are taking place, the sightings and the trackings and all the events and activities. So it's a really unique perspective. Like you said, it's not somebody just studying from afar. And in our modern day, I would say it's not just somebody sitting at the internet looking stuff up. These guys are out in it and working with these local communities, interviewing firsthand accounts, researching. Even when you say something like the lizard man, which seems so far-fetched and so out there, when you hear Lyle talk about it, he brings it down to earth and he kind of grounds that conversation in as much reality as is possible when you're talking about this type of a creature. So it's very exciting to have what we consider modern day folklorists or modern day storytellers who are writing books, who are doing the research, who are bringing the science to the forefront. And you know what I love about these guys? Everyone we've talked to so far, and you'll hear it as we go in the future, these are just really nice guys.
They really are. Lyle and Troy both were really fun to talk to and very down to earth. They weren't, they definitely have a personality that can be fun and exciting, but they're not over the top flashy and all about just causing a ruckus.
Yeah, they're not trying to convince you of anything. They're not trying to sell you on anything. It's just, this is what it is, folks. And here's the story. And that's what I love about it. So let's get into our conversation with Lyle Blackburn. Stay tuned at the end of the podcast to hear the full-length version of one of his hit songs and hear him talk about upcoming projects as well. Thanks so much for being with us. Visit us at themonsterguys.com, on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, at The Monster Guys. We also have a brand spanking new, and so new that there's not really much going on with it right now, but I'm going to throw it out there. We've got our new Patreon page. Just go to patreon.com/The Monster Guys. We'd love any support you can throw our way. We're getting bigger, we're getting better, and some really cool things coming down the pike. Without further ado, Michael, here's Lyle Blackburn. Ladies and gentlemen, Lyle Blackburn with us on the show today. Lyle, welcome to the Monster Guys podcast. How you doing?
Doing good. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. It's our pleasure, and we're going to get into some really interesting conversation, specifically about the Boggy Creek Monster, or the Fouke Monster. Am I saying that correctly?
You are.
Okay. Just a really fascinating topic, and in our travels around, when Michael and I do shows as the Monster Guys and field questions about folklore and paranormal activity, a lot of times we get questions about the Boggy Creek Monster. So it'll be good to hear from you, an expert on the topic. You've been researching this for years now. You got a couple of books about it. We're going to talk about all of that. Before we get into conversation about the Boggy Creek Monster, what can you tell us about you? We'd like to get to know you a little bit better.
Well, yeah, I'm a guy who has obviously done a lot of research into the Boggy Creek case, and that sort of has stemmed from my fascination with this sort of subject. And when I was a kid, I was always kind of a fan of horror movies and all things monstrous, as a kid. But the one thing that really gripped my imagination was cryptozoology, the possibility of unknown creatures that may be living in the forests and lakes among us. And at some point in my childhood, I saw a movie called The Legend of Boggy Creek in a drive-in, and the movie was inspired by this Boggy Creek Fouke Monster case, and the movie was quite popular and showed in theaters and drive-ins all throughout the 70s and made a big impact. Well, I live in Texas, and that is about 3 hours away from me, so I had grown up hunting with my father. We'd been camping in Texas and Arkansas and all points in between. So that was, for me, something that really hit home. I love the subject of Bigfoot, but of course, being from Texas at that point, my understanding was that was exclusive to the Pacific Northwest, which was very far away. But with the Legend of Boggy Creek, this was something, in my home territory, and being a horror movie, of course, I really loved it. So fast forward, I became a musician and spent many years doing that. But later on in life, started doing some writing. And when I started looking for an idea to write a book, I thought, well, what is my favorite subject? And I thought Bigfoot, unexplained creatures. And I thought the Legend of Boggy Creek was supposed to be about based on a true story of sightings. So I set out, and this has been years ago, to research the subject and ended up writing a book on that. And that's sort of what propelled me into the world of cryptozoology, I suppose. And the book was very well received. And following that, I was contacted by several TV shows that wanted to feature the Boggy Creek story. And so I've done a lot of TV, Finding Bigfoot, Monsters and Mysteries in America, and did some story producing for that show, and have since gone on to write other books about these subjects. And that's sort of what brings me here today as someone who I suppose is knowledgeable in these subjects, and I enjoy them, and I'm still fascinated by them as I was as a child. So it's something that has really basically consumed my life at this point, which is a good thing.
That's a good thing. And actually, we're going to get a little bit more into your music and your books and all the stuff you just talked about later. So anybody listening, you're curious about that, we're going to talk about that. I'm going to end the show with one of Lyle's songs. He actually has a video for it. It's the first song I ever heard from your band, Ghoultown. Is that correct?
Yes.
So we'll end the show with that. In between all that, we're going to talk monsters. I don't know any kid who isn't fascinated with monsters, things that go bump in the night, what's in the closet, dreaming about things when you're on those long car ride trips. I grew up in the South, in the Southeast, so I remember going on car trips and looking out the window at the woods and, the lakes passing by, and then when you get into mountainous terrain and you just wonder what could be lurking there. So I definitely follow you on the fascination and the interest with all things monsters as a kid, and it certainly, as the Monster Guys, has followed us into adulthood. I agree with you. I think that's a good thing. I don't think it's a bad thing at all.
That's right. I mean, when I see the name of a show called The Monster Guys, it's a no-brainer. I want to be on that show. These guys, they know what's up.
I'll take that as a compliment.
Yes, it is.
Just for a point of interest, you've got a brand new book about the Boggy Creek Monster. I believe it's called Beyond Boggy Creek.
Right, yes. It's called Beyond Boggy Creek: In Search of the Southern Sasquatch. Yeah, it's basically somewhat of a follow-up to my first book, The Beast of Boggy Creek, which was quite popular. And in this case, what I do is sort of start with some of the newer sightings that have taken place in the Boggy Creek area. And then I sort of use the terrain to span out from there all throughout the South. One of the premises is of these creatures is they travel creeks and waterways, and it certainly appears to be true. So I sort of start expanding out on the waterways and talk about other cases that may not be as well known, but are certainly just as fascinating, that have occurred over the years. So ultimately it's a sort of a history of legends and sighting reports, history of Sasquatch-like creatures all throughout the Deep South. So quite an undertaking, but something that I very much enjoyed, and I think people who have enjoyed my other books will find this equally entertaining as well.
Absolutely. That's very cool. And I know the further into this discussion that we get tonight, and when we get to talking about the books later on, people are going to want to grab that up pretty fast. So I'm excited about that. Let's step back. Let's go back a little bit in history. What can you tell us about the Boggy Creek Monster or the Fouke Monster? Give us some insight, the history, first contact, any of those significant sightings. Take us back a little bit and explain to us what it is and what we need to know coming up to now about the Boggy Creek Monster.
Okay, well, I'll try to put that in a nutshell because it does encompass a number of years. But essentially, this creature first came to the attention of the public in southern Arkansas near the town of Fouke in May of 1971. And in this case, some people had moved into town for work, and they were living at a little, wood frame rent house smack dab on the edge of the woods. I mean, Fouke is a very, very small town, and at the time it had about a population of 500. And, people lived and worked in the outlying areas that were very near the Sulphur River bottoms and the Red River Valley watershed, extensive, rugged and swampy terrain. But anyway, these folks lived there not too long and began to experience something creeping around on the porch. It kept returning, and they finally got a glimpse of it. And from what they could tell, it appeared to be walking upright. It was, larger than a man and appeared to be covered in hair. And that was reinforced on one evening when this thing put its hand through the window, apparently trying to grab either their pet or, just to grab someone inside. And that was sort of the last straw. And they borrowed the shotgun from the landlord and confronted this thing and took some shots at it. And ultimately, it was dark and they couldn't quite get a good shot at it, but they went out to look to see what it, if they had hit it. And one of the young men, Bobby Ford, got very spooked and ended up said, "Hey guys, I'm heading back up to the house. This is just freaking me out." So as he was en route towards the house, something came around the corner and grabbed him, and he fought with this thing and ended up nearly jumping through the front door. He ended up being taken to the Texarkana Hospital. Texarkana is the closest big city to there. And of course, the doctors ask what happens. He explains that it was attacked by a large hairy monster, and that makes its way to the news.
Right.
So that was the first time. But as things went on, subsequent sightings occurred, and that's when the newspaper dubbed the creature the Fouke Monster. Bigfoot was not a topic on people's minds back then. They would, any Bigfoot creature, you would be given a name such as, Fouke Monster, whatever regional thing. And also, as well as this kind of became a topic, a lot of the old timers said, well, hey, this isn't the first time we've had reports of this. And so things started coming out that there had been quite a longer history of sightings in this area that dated back to the 60s, 50s, and even the 40s of sightings of a, upright, 7-foot tall, man-like hairy creature in the area. And all of this was just hitting the newspaper right and left, and that inspired a Texarkana man by the name of Charles B. Pierce, who was looking to do a documentary or a film to come down there, and he ultimately made the movie The Legend of Boggy Creek, which, like I said, went on to be very successful and made this whole thing very famous.
I hear that was very scary back at the time. I think I watched recently a talk you had done at a convention, and you had said special effects, it kind of stands up to today, but back then it was actually very terrifying for the time.
Oh, yeah, exactly. I mean, it was, in a way, it was the blueprint for the dreaded found footage approach they use in horror movies today, because it was shot in kind of a documentary style, because it kind of did start as a documentary, but it was frightening because it just was so grainy and he didn't use actors. He literally got the people who had actual encounters to reenact those things. And, their dialect was authentic. They were real people. They, came across as such, and the way they sort of kept the monster shadowy and, in the background worked very well. So yeah, it was super scary. I remember seeing it as a kid in a drive-in. Well, I mean, I was very young, and it, freaked me out, freaked out my family.
Yeah.
And it became a very big movie. It was kind of the Blair Witch Project of its time, really, because it was made for about $160,000 and went on to make an estimated $25 million.
Wow.
And that is, huge. And it did directly, guys like Eduardo Sanchez, the co-director of Blair Witch Project, cited The Legend of Boggy Creek as one of his big influences, and especially in the approach he was using to make that movie. So it was influential. And again, it just made the Fouke Monster super famous. And so, in my personal research, once I decided to do a book and started going to Fouke over and over and to talk to the locals, I found many more sightings and stories that were not made public, and in fact dated it, the first local sighting, back to the early 1900s. And at the time as well, I thought I was going to be writing more of a historical book, about sightings of a creature and making of a classic B-movie horror film. But in fact, what I found was that the sightings had continued ever since. It's just that they really weren't made public, and a lot of them kept among the locals. And so my book became, a very contemporary story where I tell the history, and then I went forward into the modern sightings. And there's still sightings that I investigate. And again, like with my new book, Beyond Boggy Creek, I got to pick up and bring people up to date on some of the newer ones. So it's something that's ongoing and something that has a long history with it, and has become ultimately the most famous southern Sasquatch case there ever was.
That's all so very interesting, and there's so many implications, especially going back to the early 1900s, that these stories existed. And I'm going to ask another question trailing off of that thought in a moment, but before I ask that, I need to ask, is this, you said it's the southern Sasquatch, is this a Bigfoot? Is this part of the Bigfoot family? I've heard some people refer to the Boggy Creek Monster as a Bigfoot-like creature or species, and we actually recently interviewed somebody who is involved in DNA research on Bigfoot and said that sometimes some of these creatures, these species seem similar, but the DNA is different. What about the Boggy Creek Monster? Is this a Bigfoot creature, or is this a Bigfoot-like creature, for lack of a better way to describe it?
Well, I certainly think it fits into the category of Bigfoot, and I often do use that term Bigfoot-like because in the South there can be some other more ape-like traits that surface in these reports, and I think the Fouke monster fits into that southern profile of Bigfoot that doesn't quite necessarily match what you see in the Pacific Northwest, but I think they're certainly related, part of the same species. Maybe they could have adapted to the particular location where they live. The mountains versus a southern swamp are two different things.
That is true. In one of your lectures, I had heard you say that the print that they've been known to left behind, that I guess there were a couple different prints that were recorded, they seem to have fewer digits. I thought you had said 3 at the time. I can't remember if that was the correct number or not.
Yeah, that's correct. And a lot of that comes from some tracks that were found in 1971 that were later dramatized in the movie, and that became associated with the Fouke monster, is that it has 3 toes. Now, since I've found individuals that have some tracks that fit more in the Bigfoot profile, they have 5 toes, and the theories could range from deformities, from inbreeding, particular way the creature walks, just a number of theories to explain that. And it's certainly that the Fouke monster is not the only southern Bigfoot-like creature that, has been said to have 3 toes. There's been 3-toed tracks found in other places in the South. So while it's not always a consistent, thing in these footprints, there certainly have been 3-toed tracks found. So it's something that is often associated with southern Sasquatch.
Going back to that previous question, when you made the statement about these stories that were coming forth from, as far back as the early 1900s and probably even further than that, I would imagine, do we have any communication or stories, oral traditions from Native American communities about the Fouke monster specifically that you can share, and maybe have any further insight from the Native American community about this creature?
Well, yeah, certainly. If you go back into the 1800s and you have to broaden the scope a little bit, there are some newspaper reports from the Arkansas area that describe what quote unquote wild men, which, reading those descriptions now very much correspond to Bigfoot or the Fouke monster type creatures. And if you look at the Indian populations that lived in that area, especially more in the Piney Woods and Caddo Lake area just south of Fouke, Caddo Indians had a term they used for a creature they referred to as basically a lost giant. And, there's no real, they don't go into long descriptions of it, and it's often very vague, but the thinking is that the creatures, the lost giants that they were describing, were flesh and blood creatures, not figures of mythology or anything like that. And if these creatures were biological or, physical creatures, then certainly, it stands to reason that they could have been describing, a Sasquatch-like creature. So, yeah, you definitely have those Native American traditions that correspond to the same areas, where people report that today.
It seems the further that we dig into the topic of Bigfoot or similar stories like the Boggy Creek Monster, it seems that literally the U.S. and North America is riddled with sightings, with encounters with what I would even term as families or tribes of these creatures. I mean, almost now in researching this the past several months, you can almost find any part on the map where these creatures exist. And it seems like they're becoming either more popular in the media or it's more common to have encounters. And I don't know, is that because of construction and development? What are we seeing here in this trend, this interest, and the scope of their existence just reaching so much farther across the map than what we originally believed?
Yeah, certainly. It just seems like, the map is just filling up with pins of locations of sightings that is just astounding, really. A long time ago, people just sort of associated Bigfoot with the Pacific Northwest. But if you do much digging, like you said, you quickly find that they've been sighted everywhere. Now, I do find that there are particular pockets or hot spots of activity, and those typically do, whether coincidental or logically, correspond with places that these creatures would actually live. You don't find a lot of reports in West Texas, for example. This is not a terrain where they would survive long. They would be seen far too easily, but you don't find a lot of sightings there. But in East Texas, which is very heavily forested, the piney woods, there's a lot of sightings there and all over the map. So I think it's probably a combination of what you say. It's that it's a little more acceptable now to say you've seen one of these creatures, with Animal Planet finding Bigfoot on for the last 8 or 9 years. It's not what it was years ago. People think, well, I'm not going to say anything because people say I'm crazy. Now
Right.
It's like, you're not the only one, obviously, and people will come forward. Could be development and things like that, have them on the move. Any number of reasons why the sightings have increased. But I think if you really delve into looking at old newspapers and talking to people that live in these places, you find that there were a lot of sightings even back then, even when it wasn't necessarily publicized by the media. So there's been sightings all along in these certain areas, and it would astound people, I think, to see, how many of these locations there really are.
As somebody who's always been fascinated by monsters and legends and folklore and always wondered which ones could be true and which ones are just fiction, last episode we talked with Troy Hudson about Sasquatch and some of the projects that they're doing. And he was talking about how several people are quite aware of what is around them on their property in rural areas. And to me, in that moment, I was kind of astounded because I've always wanted to see proof see the evidence and everything. So to me, it was strange that somebody wouldn't come forward with that. And, the way he described it, he was like, these people know that this exists. They interact with it on a pretty regular basis. What happens when they do come forward? You have, city slickers and, other people who want to come hunt down media attention that come in and kind of mess stuff up and cause a big ruckus. And I guess at that point, it made sense. Listening to you talking earlier as well at a convention, I heard you talk about I can't remember what the band was, but they were a Grammy Award-winning band, and it was somebody who had actually seen what was believed to be the Boggy Creek Monster, and it didn't click until recently that it was the Boggy Creek Monster. I guess the story you told was that they were in the car with their cousin and driving down the road, and they saw what looked like a guy in a fur coat jogging down the road and didn't think of anything of it until they saw Boggy Creek in the media.
Right, yeah, that was Carl Finch in a band called Brave Combo, and his sighting is extremely significant to me in relation especially to the Boggy Creek case, because there had been a lot of reports from locals in the area southwest of Boggy Creek near the Sulphur River bottoms of this creature back in the 60s. And some of the things that were dramatized in the legend of Boggy Creek had actually occurred in the 60s. Now, a lot of people said, well, this is the locals were making these stories up, or, whatever. People try to explain it away. But Carl Finch was driving between Shreveport and Texarkana and was passing right in the area where these rash of sightings had occurred in the 60s, and saw an upright, man-like creature covered in hair running on the side of the road. They were obviously scared him, and they passed on by and disappeared into the taillights, and they didn't know what to make of it, because in 1967, Bigfoot was not on the minds of people. They really didn't know anything about Bigfoot down here in the South at that time. So he just thought, man, what the hell was that, basically? And, drove on. And it wasn't until the mid 70s, when he saw Legend of Boggy Creek, he's like, oh my God, that must have been what I saw down there. Well, he doesn't live there. He doesn't live in the area. He's not from the area. And it corroborates what those locals had been reporting. He's sort of an independent witness. And when I said, well, you probably don't know this, but in 1967 is when there was a ton of sightings going on down there, as the locals recalled. And so for me, that's very significant, because it was an independent affirmation of what they were reporting. It wasn't just confined to local stories.
Yeah, because a lot of times these stories, like you say, are confined to local communities, and it just becomes a local legend type of thing. So it is particularly interesting that someone from outside that area can bring confirmation by the way of their own experience. How about yourself? I know you spend a lot of time in the area. You do a lot of research. I believe you told me even just this week you've been down there camping. What can you tell me about your own firsthand experience, encounters, or experiences in that region with the Boggy Creek Monster?
Well, I mean, personally, I've never had a sighting myself. Nothing I would, definitively say that was the creature or a Bigfoot. I enjoy the great outdoors. I enjoy camping, and, grew up in that sort of a pastime, and would certainly love to see one of these things. And in the times that I've been in that particular area camping and, looking around the woods, and part of that came from, if I'm going to write a book about that area, if I'm going to research and know, not only talk to the people, I need to go into the areas where these people say they saw it. I need to go to Mercer Bayou and Sulphur River, and so I did all that. And in that experience, I've heard something howling once that myself and the guy I was with, who incidentally was a trapper in Mississippi when he was younger, has a lot of experience in the woods. Neither he nor I could identify this very eerie howl that we heard occurring on one occasion. So while I didn't see anything, I could say, well, it's possible that I heard the creature. And other people who have been in the area that have described what they say, we've heard it, and they make the so-called sound, and that's exactly what I heard. But yeah, I've never had a sighting, and but I spent a lot of time up there. And well, just yesterday I was sitting at the great pleasure of visiting the home of a gentleman named Keith Crabtree, and he actually played the monster in the Legend of Boggy Creek movie.
Oh wow!
And that was, I've gotten to know people, and I, enjoy the reminiscing about the making of the movie, and kind of a total geek on it. I know, and I want to know everything about the movie and the facts and how everything was done, and I've to the nth degree. It's fun for me. But anytime I'm speaking with a local, whether it's sitting at somebody's house like that or just visiting some of the cafes or anything else, the subject of the Boggy Creek Monster comes up immediately. I mean, especially now that people know me. It's a topic that's discussed very matter-of-factly. It's something that people they'll tell you their experiences. They don't want to be on camera, and they may not want their name used. But it seems like it's not long before somebody will be willing to kind of tell you something, or say, hey, my cousin saw that thing once. And, it's very matter-of-fact on the topic up there. And they're not trying to wow you with the story. They're not trying to amaze you. It's just the facts of life there.
Yeah, this is what happens, and this is life.
Yeah, and it's amazing in that, and just to kind of, that's given me the perspective, not researching a Bigfoot case on the internet or something that's very impersonal, but like being there, getting to know the people over the years gives me a good perspective on just what could this be? Is there really something behind this? Could it be possible? I just come away from it with a feeling that there's certainly enough remote areas down there still in those bottomlands that I find not every person that tells me a story do I think it's necessarily credible, but the majority of them, and a good percentage of them, I do, and I just cannot explain what they've seen other than they've seen some unknown entity walking through those woods down there.
I recently listened to an interview with, is it Seth Breedlove that worked the Boggy Creek Monster documentary?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I had listened to an interview with him, I think yesterday, and he was talking about how one night you guys were doing a shoot, and he talked about how all night over in the water he could hear like rocks dropping in there. And then they had finished a scene or a shot of something, and before the camera or the audio stopped rolling, there was a very mournful howl. And I guess he kind of cracked a joke just because he didn't think it was legitimate at the time, but then they heard the howl again and then another drop in the water. Were you there for that moment, or?
Yeah, I was on camera interviewing one of the witnesses at the location where he had a couple of, like a kind of a partial sighting, and he'd had another very distinct sighting. I mean, it was just one of those things that, you almost hope happens when you're filming a movie like this, but hardly ever does. But it was super hard to get down there because it had rained. It was very muddy, and to get from this guy's house on this county road down to literally to the edge of the bayou, their car wouldn't make it. They had some rent-a-car. I had a four-wheel drive truck, and we managed to get the crew down there and literally set up and filming right on the edge of the swamp. And as we were filming, you hear this really weird howl come out of the back, and the witness just nonchalantly goes, "Yeah, there's one right there."
Oh my gosh.
And now I know this guy because I had first interviewed him several years ago, and we've gotten to know each other, gotten to know him well. So it was, so he's somebody that I put a lot of faith in, but it was just pure lottery luck that howl came out. And of course, it worked its way into the documentary where we play it back and say that we could have very well possibly heard the creature as we were filming. Pretty cool and pretty eerie. I could see, I've heard that before. And of course, the witness was very nonchalant, but the rest of the crew, these guys are, Yankees from up north and have never been standing on the edge of a swamp. They were like a little bit creeped out. So I'm like, hey, this is good.
Right. Can we go back to the hotel now?
Yeah, no, they were good sports. We had taken them out, and I tried to, try to take them to the place to get the money shots, so we drug them all through the swamps and the waterways, and it's really spooky out there. It really is. There's alligators swimming next to the boats, and but they really wanted to get the good stuff, so they were willing to go wherever we needed to.
Yeah, that's the deep South for you.
Right, everyday life.
That's right. Going back to an earlier story you told about one of the first recorded sightings, I guess in our modern era, about how the people were finding their way to Fouke and establishing community there and everything, and kind of creepy how they had one of these creatures reach in, maybe for their pet or something, and just reach right in through their window. I wonder often when things like that happen, people that encounter these type of experiences are not actually in any danger, but this is a species that is as curious about us as we are about them. I don't know if you would find that to be true, and also as a part of that conversation, what else can you tell us about the behavior, the Boggy Creek Monster, their habits, diet? Have you noticed any language patterns or any type of constructs in the woods? I know a lot of Bigfoot sightings sometimes have these tunnels or these triangular constructs in the woods. What can you tell us about that kind of stuff? And are we talking about a monster that residents consider dangerous, or are they just curious like we are about them?
Well, I think in some ways the Boggy Creek Monster in particular, and maybe southern Sasquatch in general, has kind of gotten the reputation that they're often more dangerous or aggressive. Some of that, yeah, there are definite cases where you have these creatures apparently showing aggressive behavior, such as the encounter I talked about, the Ford family, and that was used as the climactic scene in the Legend of Boggy Creek because it was so dramatic. It basically assailed these people's home. That kind of helped to build the reputation, because the Legend of Boggy Creek and the movie, in my research, what I found was that the sightings that they reenacted and talked about in that movie were really based, almost all of them were based on real reports by real people and often reenacted by the people who had the sightings. But of course, the movie, it's a horror movie. It plays up the aggressive parts and all that. And so that sort of gave the reputation that the creature was very dangerous. But of course, if you look at the whole of the sightings, you also have, a lot of your typical Bigfoot type sightings where it's seen briefly, it's seen in the woods, it's seen running across the road, things like that, where it's just trying to get out of sight. I think that the aggressive behavior certainly could depend on the individual with, the creature itself. I mean, you are covered in hair if you're living in a hot, humid swamp. I mean, there's insects down there. I mean, I think I'd be kind of pissed off too, and, apt to lash out against these encroaching humans. There was a sighting in about early 2000s by a coon hunter down there, and this is a well-seasoned coon hunter. I mean, not afraid of anything. If you're a coon hunter and you go out at night into these swamps, it's spooky stuff. And this is not your average guy, but he ended up coming face to face with one of these creatures, and he said it basically reached down and splashed water at him, at he and his dog who was cowering and behind him, and sort of made this aggressive move toward him, and then the thing just took off. That was another case where, the thing could have easily killed this guy. He didn't go that far, but he did make a sort of a warning or aggressive, move towards this old coon hunter, who incidentally sold all his coon hunting dogs and his guns and said he's never going back down in there again, and which, made a lot of sense.
Yeah, I tend to have that effect on a guy.
Right. Even this, I'm thinking, man, if this coon hunter's freaked out by that, I mean, I want to see one of these, but who knows, Anyway, as far as the behavior and things, I mean, a lot of it's just assumptions. I mean, like any Bigfoot areas, you do have places where you find what appear to be constructs out of tree limbs and things like that. And people have even pointed these out to me. In my experience with those, I've never found them to be, I find it hard to believe that these creatures would expend a lot of energy building something like that for no real purpose. It's not like they're sleeping under it. And what the first thing I always ask, and I've looked, is any kind of animal covered in hair that is building a nest of any sort. There's hairs to be found everywhere. Yet there's never any hair associated with this. So I've never seen any of these structures that I could 100% say, hey, this was built by something. It's a lot of it's conjecture. And as far as diet, I think the creature would have to be omnivorous. It would just be opportunistic. And living in these swampy areas, there is no lack of things to eat.
Right.
Roots, vegetation, and, fish, frogs, even up to, there's hogs. The hog population is booming down there. If you like pork, you got no shortage of little pigs to take. And in fact, I have there was a report I took in detail in my book that someone saw one of these creatures actually grab and kill a hog. So,
wow.
If those are to be believed, then it seems like they would take the opportunity to be carnivorous. So, no lack of things to eat, no lack of water, shelter, anything like that. It's certainly possible that a small population of creatures could exist down there in relative seclusion.
Yeah, I was going to say, which has allowed this species, these creatures, if you will, to become the master of illusion and or of camouflage, and being able to be so elusive and stay out of the public eye, if they will.
Yeah, exactly, and that's exactly what they would have to be. I mean, if you operate under the premise that they exist and they've managed to stay elusive this long, it's only logical that they have some amount of intelligence to be able to avoid us, and that they would have those techniques or skills to blend in, to camouflage, to move quickly out of sight. Ultimate masters of survival and illusion, to be able to stay out of sight, 99% of the time. And then there's the 1% where, somebody gets a glimpse across the road, or maybe the one Sasquatch gets a little curious, like you say, and he approaches a house. Or
Lyle, in your investigation into the Boggy Creek Monster, or your research, obviously you've written a couple of definitive books about this phenomenon and this species. What else do we need to know? What would you share with us if you had the open mic to say, hey, this is what I'd like you to know about Boggy Creek Monster? What can you tell us from your own investigative research and insight concerning the creature?
Well, for me, it's of course, without having, sat and observed one of these at length, anything that I can offer is purely speculation. That's what we have at best. But going right along with that, I can say that I feel like there is something to this, especially from having spent years focusing. I mean, I've researched Bigfoot all across the South, but obviously Falk is, having written a book about it, it's somewhere where I've concentrated a lot of specific research. And I can tell you that even if you dismiss 95% of the people that have reported sightings, there is, a good portion of people that I've gotten to know, that I've put full faith in their credibility, their story matches up or can be corroborated by someone or some such thing, to where I can tell you these folks saw something that cannot be explained. Now, I can't tell you 100% that's a giant ape or it's a Neanderthal or any such specifics like that, but I can tell you that these are average people who weren't out looking for Bigfoot. They may have known about the legend of Boggy Creek or the Fountain Monster, but it wasn't something they were looking for fame and fortune, and they were just in I call it the right place at the right time. They may call it the wrong place at the wrong time. But,
right.
I put a lot of stock in what these individuals are saying. I can tell you they saw something. So it's just sort of leaves it so we've got to keep the case open. And in the case of Boggy Creek, it's just a fascinating story that represents a little bit of everything, from folklore to mysterious monsters to local legends to the impact this thing has had on that little town, the making of a influential horror movie. I mean, the story's just got everything. And that's what I really loved about writing the book, because it had so much to offer, it as well as just a great story of almost the forgotten wilderness, places where most people nowadays would never go. I mean, some people go camping. Well, they go to a state park. I mean, this is not state park. This is going into the rugged wilderness and imagining, people settled back here not that long ago, on the Sulphur River, back in these bayous, and lived and existed off the land. And it's a really cool story, just the story itself. And part of why I like these, it's not just about the monster, but it's about the people who saw the monster. Who were these people? And the fascinating mystery that's continued to this day.
Yeah, and you know what? Kudos to you for digging deep and getting there with the people, with the culture, with the environment, not just being on a trek to catch the next big sighting or pump up a TV show. Obviously all of that is fun for popular culture, and Hollywood has its day from time to time with these creatures, but I love talking to people like you who are willing to, like I said, dig deep, get down into those backwoods and in that deep country and talk to the people and really get a sense of what it's all about. And I agree with you. I believe that's where the real story is. So as much as we can across a phone call, high five and pat on the back to you for that.
And honestly, as people who dig through resources often to try to find out more about folklore and history, it is refreshing to hear somebody that goes through this with a positive outlook and still considering the fact that we may not have all of the answers, so you don't jump to any conclusions.
Right. No, I appreciate that. Yeah, that's some of the fascination with it is, and I consider myself, a lot of people consider me a Bigfoot researcher, and I do concentrate a lot in that area, but in my mind, I consider me an author of books about Southern mysteries. That's mostly what I forte. People go, are you going to write a book about, you ever going to write a book about Bigfoot in, Washington? I'm like, well, there's a lot of those. And since, I don't live there, and what can I bring that somebody else hasn't already written about, but as far as, there's a lot of stuff here in the South, and that's where I live. And I love those Southern stories. I just like the Southern stories that are, involve monsters.
Right.
But yeah, I could very well write a book about settlements on the Sulphur River or something. I could very well write a book like that, but I like the Southern flavor. And so people are a big part of the writing and give you the perspective, because without the perspective of the people and without describing the location effectively, it's just another Bigfoot report. And there's a ton of those. They're just one-dimensional. So I like to bring something more to it than that.
Very cool. And we're going to touch on that a little bit more in just a moment, but I'd like to take a trip to a different part of the country just for a couple of minutes, if you will. You have also written a book about the lizard man the story is based in Bishopville, South Carolina. This is another fascinating topic to me, one that I believe is even more obscure than Boggy Creek Monster or even Bigfoot or some of those other stories and legends. This particular story, I mean, you've got sightings, you've got encounters, you've got a young man that has claimed to be attacked by this thing. This event, this creature there's been full-blown investigations. I mean, from law enforcement on this. It's even attracted, I think you said in some of your text, the likes of Dan Rather doing stories on it. Take us there for just a moment, if you will. This is a little side note off of the Boggy Creek Monster topic, but I think it's really interesting, and it's a point of interest for me from you as an author and a researcher. Talk to us a little bit about the lizard man in South Carolina.
Well, yeah, it's definitely, on par with what we've talked about with these, southern monster cases, and that's one that attracted my attention after I had done the Beast of Boggy Creek book. I'm thinking it was, it sold well, and I'm like, okay, well, this is cool. I should write another book, and kind of thinking about all the cryptid cases, that I knew about. And I thought, I always wondered about that case in South Carolina where this so-called lizard man had attacked some people and there was some sightings. And so I went out there to Bishopville, and again, it's a small town and it's in proximity to a swamp called Skateboard Swamp. And there in the late 1980s were the first reports in which people in the area began to see this sort of a reptilian humanoid type creature, stood 6 or 7 feet tall. It walked upright on 2 legs. It was man-like. And they said it was either brownish or green, and they thought it had scaly skin. The locals just gave it the name Lizard Man, which is, can evoke all kinds of crazy images in your head. But essentially, it was very human-like, anthropomorphic. It was, just creepy, and it lived in the swamp. So I went out there and did the same thing. I visited with locals. I dug into the library, into the archives out there, and got all the newspaper reports, and spoke to this sheriff. He's now retired, but he was on the case back then and looked into it very seriously, not necessarily because he thought there could be a lizard man, but ultimately there was good, honest citizens reporting this, and he thought, well, if this is, if I don't look into this and somebody ends up getting killed or hurt, they're going to point the finger at me because I didn't do anything. So it had all the ingredients of the small town monster type case, and as well, you had a lot of police documentation to back it up, whereas most of these cryptid cases you don't. But Sheriff Truesdale took it seriously enough to often have like a family once saw something jump out and run into the road. We had them down to the police station and had them all separated and write down what they had seen. So I've got the document literally in their handwriting describing this event, which is a lot better because that was just a day or two after their encounter. So I'm not interviewing somebody who's trying to remember 30 years back. They're literally, I'm looking at their words as they were fresh. So, I thought it was a great case, and went down there with an associate of mine, Cindy Lee, who does a lot of research with me on these cases, and we thought it was, just a really fascinating story. And so I thought, well, this will make a perfect book. It's sort of this modern day creature from the Black Lagoon, literally. And again, I'm not out to prove what that is, and couldn't prove it. Obviously, something like a lizard man or any sort of reptilian humanoid is a little more of a leap in terms of natural biology than even a Bigfoot. So
I don't know, Lyle. Have you watched the X-Files?
Well, I did see that new one where there was a lizard man guy, and
there you go.
which incidentally, I think that was very much influenced by the Bishopville Lizard Man case.
Listen, man, if it's on the X-Files, it must be true.
Totally. It's a very smart show. But yeah, and it attracted a lot of media at the time, and just a great story. So I ended up, writing that as my second book, and I thought it was also something that established me as a little more. I love Bigfoot, and there's a lot to that story, and I've got a ton of sightings and things I've done over the years. But that gave me a chance to write about something that wasn't necessarily Bigfoot. It was a cryptid. It was another swampy case. It was a southern mystery, and I really enjoyed doing that project.
Yeah, very cool story and a lot of documentation to back that up. You mentioned that was your second book. What I'd like to do is switch gears here just for a moment. And by the way, before we talk about your books, I will say for those listening that you have a really good network of websites. I don't know if lyleblackburn.com is the central location you'd like people to go to. That's kind of where I started. But from there, share with your links and your resources and the different things you have there, I would encourage anybody listening to filter through your network of websites. You can learn a lot from Lyle just off of his websites, and I believe there's also a place that if people have sightings or reports to share, they can do that with you through your website as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, my contact information is on there, and always welcome any sort of report and try to follow up on, as much of those as I can, and oftentimes just put it into context for people. Like, they'll ask, hey, I saw this and I live here. Has anybody else reported something? And a lot of times I can say, yeah, as a matter of fact, you're not the only one, because I've got other cases. But yeah, certainly I enjoy getting those reports, and LyleBlackburn.com has all the links to whatever information, my books and the Boggy Creek Monster film that we released, the documentary, and good place to start.
So we'll include all of these links in our show notes to make it easy for people to find you. The Lizard Man, The True Story of the Bishopville Monster, you said was your second book. Your first book obviously was The Beast of Boggy Creek. If I'm not mistaken, that was a bestseller and is just a definitive work in the research and in the topic of the Boggy Creek Monster. Like we said earlier in the show, you've got a brand new book right now that's out just as of this week, Beyond Boggy Creek, In Search of the Southern Sasquatch. You also have a book with Rue Morgue Publications, I believe it is, the Rue Morgue magazine people would be most familiar with. You've got a book called Monstro Bizarro, Essential Manual of Mysterious Monsters from their library. And then, of course, you said you talked a little bit about your documentary film, Boggy Creek Monster. That's just, if I'm not mistaken, about 6 months old. It's not too old, out on the market. With your books and your documentary, talk to us about those. What would you like us to know about those? My opinion, these are some fascinating books and well written and really good things to get your hands on. But I'd like to hear from you. Talk to us about your books and your movie.
Yeah, I did The Beast of Boggy Creek, and yeah, it was, like I said, it was rewarding just to have researched that myself, but the reception to the book was surprising and very well received. So then I set out and wrote The Lizard Man, and again, people responded well to that. Among all the other things I do, I write for the Canadian horror magazine Rue Morgue, and I had known those guys for quite some time, and they really love the cryptozoology topic. And cryptozoology does enter horror movies quite a bit, of course. Yes, even in The Legend of Boggy Creek, there you go. So I kind of got on board as whether I'm reviewing cheesy Bigfoot movies or doing a column on more serious cryptozoology. I've enjoyed writing for them, and they do a library series of books that collect some past articles and then have a lot of new content, and they're put together by some of the writers that work for the magazine. So I had the opportunity to do one based on my column called Monstro Bizarro, but it's essentially a book it's not like my other books where they're just a written theme throughout. This sort of has articles that I've written on cryptozoology in films, cryptozoology, the influence in pop culture, in toys, and things like that. And this book is much more magazine style, a lot of pictures, they're just so cool, graphically illustrated. So that was a fun project that I did. That came out in October. And then I had teamed up with the filmmakers from Ohio. They have a company called Small Town Monsters who had been making films about, small town monsters. And I had met the owner and director Seth Breedlove several years ago, and we both sort of hit it off in our mutual admiration for these small town monster cases. And so he had approached me, and we had discussed, doing something on the Boggy Creek Monster. And so we did team up and do a film, and that's been out since, actually only since November. So it's pretty new. We're just it's on a lot of the film circuits right now, and we've got a great response from that. But it's a great extension of the Boggy Creek story because, you've got the Legend of Boggy Creek. You've got my book, The Beast of Boggy Creek, which gives you the full history. But with the film, we were able to let some of these witnesses speak in their own words, and also obviously visually take you to some of the sites where the sightings have occurred, and even some of the sites that were originally shown in the Legend of Boggy Creek. and talk about the perspective of it. So it's in some ways it's the Beast of Boggy Creek come to life on film. But Seth and those guys do a really beautiful job of presenting a documentary, and very proud of how that came out. So that was my foray into films, and I'll be doing some executive producing on a new film that we're working on coming up. We're doing a Mothman film next. In the meantime, my new book that just came out, Beyond Boggy Creek, which again sort of picks up with the latest at Boggy Creek and really expands all over the southern U.S. I mean, for years now, I've collected a lot of these sightings and looked into a lot of history of these Sasquatch and skunk ape type things in the South. So finally, I'm able to bring all those out. It's taken me a while to work on this book. So needless to say, I've been busy.
Yeah, definitely. It's very cool. And you have definitely caught my ear on your next project. I'd love to hook up with you in the future when you're in the throes of that or have that completed about the Mothman, because that's a long time interest for me there. So good luck to you on that one. I can't wait for that one.
Yeah, I'm pretty excited. That's actually gonna be out this summer. So, and we're looking at a little different approach where this isn't going to be the history of the Mothman, an exhaustive thing like that. It's really we're talking about the 13 months from when the first sightings were reported up until the collapse of the bridge, and it's just sort of the timeline of that specific set of events specifically. And we've got some witnesses and audio of folks that have never told their story. So it's interesting to bring to light some new things, as well as kind of come at it with this focused approach with that spooky Mothman case. It's just so cool,
Yeah, definitely. Well, for everybody listening, we will be doing some reviews of Lyle's books on themonsterguys.com, also of the documentary. Go to lyleblackburn.com, check out the books, get your hands on them, check out the documentary. He's got just a beautiful network of sites with a lot of information if you want to learn more about the Boggy Creek Monster, the Lizard Man, and in the future about the Mothman. Definitely want to get in on this. Lyle, man, it's just been a real pleasure talking to you. I love listening to the stories, your approach to everything, just very down to earth and real and true to what's going on in that part of the country. So thank you so much for being with us. Really appreciate this.
Hey, no problem. I really appreciate you having me on.
And we did mention about your songs. We introed the podcast with a little bit of one of your tunes, and we're going to exit the podcast with one of your songs tonight. That being said, tell us about Ghoultown just a little bit, because that's a fun project. I don't know how long you've been doing that, but you're an accomplished musician, songwriter, and your band, that's definitely something to listen to, man. I love that stuff.
Yeah, thanks. This band has been going longer than I really ever thought it would. I put this together in the late 90s, so it's been quite a while, but I'd spent years prior to that as a musician in various bands on labels and things, and Ghoultown was something that was totally unique. I mean, I don't even know how to describe the music. That's been a problem. It's just Ghoultown. It's kind of this somewhere between Johnny Cash and Rob Zombie, and
I think you just pegged it, man. I think you just pegged it. You're a storyteller somewhere between those two guys.
Yeah, exactly. It's hard to describe, but it's a lot of fun. And the band, early on, we did a lot of touring and a lot of playing and really got out there. But that's spending so many years doing that. I really enjoyed kind of getting into once I really just took a break from the band to write the book, thinking I would come back. I didn't know the book was going to turn into television shows and documentaries. I had no idea, but it's fine because the touring thing has gotten on. But the fan base for Ghoultown is ironically increased. I don't know if that's from the visibility of me, but fan base is there. And in fact, we've been working on a new album this year, and it's going to come out in March. So the band continues on, and hopefully we're doing some shows in the UK coming up this some festivals and stuff. So we just kind of do big gigs at this point, kind of pack it all into as much as we can at once and do festivals and things like that, rather than just club tours and the big tours. So yeah, it's a lot of fun, and so yeah, that's the music side of me, and it continues on. And again, there's links to Ghoultown from my Lyle Blackburn side if somebody's into the music. So but yeah, it's cool that you guys are playing a tune. A lot of people go, "You're in a band?" I'm like, "Oh yeah, I got this thing. I got this too." It's like I don't want to deal too much out of it.
Right. I think we opened the podcast podcast with your song Cruel Winds of Dusk, and we're going to end it with Drink with the Living Dead. Drink with the Living Dead is the first song I heard from you, and I found it by way of video through one of your sites. So we will obviously in our show notes put links to that. We'll link to the video because that's a very cool video, very artsy and well done. In the meantime, Lyle, you're busy these days. I noticed that you're speaking in a lot of conventions and conferences. You've got the new book out. You're working on another documentary. You've just put out this latest documentary on the Boggy Creek Monster. So take time to breathe every once in a while, man. We want you to hang around. But regardless, we definitely love what you're doing, and it's been a pleasure having you on the show. I encourage anybody, again, to go to lyleblackburn.com, find out where he's speaking, his new books that are coming out, get a hold of his documentaries. You won't be disappointed. Lyle, thank you again so much for being on the Monster Guys podcast. We really appreciate it.
Thanks. It was awesome talking to you.
Yeah, man, you bet. I appreciate it.
I was sitting in the Thirsty Devil, one sheet hung to the wind, when the back wing doors creaked open and a stranger sauntered in. He moved his head from side to side and glared with a sunken eye. I heard the spin of a rusty spur as he shook off the dreary night. He lowered his hat and checked his gun and headed toward the bar. He walked on up beside me, I knew he'd traveled far. In a voice as thick as mud, he looked at the keep and said, "One shot of whiskey for myself, and one for my new friend." The patrons whispered hushed hello, they seemed to be afraid, as if a ghost had stood right up and walked out of its grave. His face was shallow and dirty, his skin like leather hide. Sure spoke like any man, but something wasn't right. So I twisted on my stool and turned to him and said, "Thanks, sir, but just the same, I'm chasing worms instead." He growled and shoved the drink my way, his eyes as cold as death. I picked the drink, she knocked him back, held straw against my hand. When 6 to midnight in the phony hands of death, now you better drink your drink and shut your mouth. If you draw against his head, you can never win. Go ahead, drink with the living dead. Who the hell do you think you are? My patience growing thin, but swallow hard I had to do when the story he began. His lips curled back and words came forth, starting up the tale. And every face inside that bar, it turned a shade of pale. My name is Stanton Creed, and I died 3 years before I shot a man to steal his drink. At least that's what they hung me for. Now I'm cursed to walk the earth and challenge every night a man to match me drink for drink, or by the bullet die. When 6 to midnight in the phony hands of death, now you better drink your drink and shut your mouth. If you draw against his head, you can never win. Go ahead, drink with the living dead. Now wait a minute, mister, no one makes me a fool. I push a shot of whiskey back on over towards school. I love a drink like any man, but that's a losing game. To drink or draw against the dead would only be insane. Stanton Creed, he tipped his hat and laughed a wicked laugh. You see, the Lord curse my soul for killing that poor man. There ain't no choice, so you must try to match me shot for shot. If you win, then you'll go free, and I can finally rot. When 6 to midnight in the phony hands of death, now you better drink your drink and shut your mouth. If you draw against his head, you can never win. Go ahead, drink with the living dead. I knew that I was screwed. If I chose to duel the dead, then I would surely lose. So I took the glass and threw the shot into my throat. I would match him drink for drink, no matter if I choked. Whiskey, tequila, vodka, rum, or gin. There ain't no man that I can't beat, beat him live or dead. So into the morning, I matched him ounce for ounce, till Stan Free fell over and a winner was announced. Now rests in his pine box and I still walk the streets, but I don't forget the night when death had chosen me. There ain't no fancy moral to go with this, I fear, lest you aim to kill a man and drink down his last beer.